Welcome back, Augustonians, and welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. My name is Jessica Lene. I'm the host and curator of Lit Friday. I'm also an art journalist and poet. Lit Friday is a monthly virtual conversation program from the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. On the final Friday of each month, we host conversations with writers and artists from the African diaspora. We also have made some changes to the way the program runs, so let's break that down and then we'll synchronize our calendars. Lit Friday is switching platforms, so from here forward, we will be live on both Facebook and YouTube. You can still continue to register for future conversations so that you can receive links and reminders, but you can also just pop onto the August Wilson African American Cultural Center Facebook or YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the final Friday of each month, and we'll be there. To stay connected to my work and Lit Friday, follow me at @hanginthere_kitty on Instagram, and you can follow the center as well. Now, let's get your calendars right. Tonight at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center at 8 p.m., we have the incomparable Maya. She's a Grammy Award winning singer and producer, and you do not want to miss this incredible opportunity to see her perform live. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., we have two jazz legends, Sean Jones and Dwayne Dolphin. The month of May is just as incredible. On May 16th, we continue our intermission, the Artful Happy Hour series. On May 23rd, we are featuring the documentary Pa Joe and the Lion. We are screening this film in conjunction with an exhibition currently up in the Victoria Gallery called Abebui Adekai, Proverb Boxes for a Life Well Traveled by Jacob Pajo Jr. I had the opportunity to co-curate this exhibition with the brilliant August Wilson African American Cultural Center curator, Kimberly Jacobs. On May 30th, we are honored to have Isabel Wilkerson on site for our Truth Sayers series. Wilkerson won a Pulitzer Prize and a National Humanities Medal. She's the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestsellers, The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And finally, on May 31st, Lit Friday brings you another brilliant award-winning writer, Araya D. Matthews, to discuss her recent publication, Bread and Circus. Visit the events page on our website, awaaacc.org, to purchase tickets and to register. Tonight, we are excited to have Maura Cheeks. Hi, Maura. Maura Cheeks is the author of Acts of Forgiveness, which received a starred review from Publishers Weekly. Her other work has been published in the Paris Review, the New York Times, the Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, Tin House, and others. In 2018, she was selected to attend Tin House's Winter Workshop and was one of 7 people selected to attend Jamel Brinkley's Tin House Craft Intensive. In 2019, she was awarded the Masthead Reporting Residency for the Atlantic's first residency program, where she worked on the feature article that would later inspire the idea for her novel. Maura graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and received a certificate in publishing from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She also holds her MBA from NYU. Thank you for being with us tonight, Maura. We are really excited to have you. And you're going to share with us from Acts of Forgiveness.
Thank you for having me.
I got to work this blur out eventually. It's a beautiful cover and a great, as I said when we were speaking before, it's great craft work. It's a great, great novel.
Thank you. I'm going to read from chapter 1 for just about 5 minutes. The diner was full of people who wanted to be around others the day the Forgiveness Act passed the House. The proximity to precedent felt good. There was no danger, no history yet per se, no need to stop routine completely. So it was enough to sit in the old diner at the blue speckled tables with scrambled eggs and large steaming mugs of coffee. Enough to ask the person next to you to pass the ketchup, and also whether they thought this would go anywhere. Not in my day, was often the answer. Enough monotony rubbed off of a dreary fall day for neighbors to linger and comment that forgiveness would never pass the Senate, as the anchor announced the House's intention to vote on it in the evening. The country, the city, the diner, connected by the same wavering thread of expectation. As Willie hurried in, she took up her usual stool beneath the television and tried to look optimistic. But she had imagined when a moment like this one came, she would be sharing the news, not watching it. Writing about representatives wrangling last-minute votes, what families needed to do to prepare for its passage, not sitting, as she was now, 34 years old in the same town where she was raised. Most days, she successfully calmed the disquiet. But today she couldn't help it and picked silently at her life choices like they were scabs. Vice president at her father's construction company, mother to a precocious daughter from a one-night stand, loving parents whom she lives with. The second half of those ellipses ruined the mirage. For a long time, she was buoyed by the belief that change was around the corner, and now that it was here, she realized she should have been more specific in her faith. The Forgiveness Act, for many reasons, threw this into sharp relief. A waitress arched her back against the counter and pointed the remote at the television, inching the president's voice up several decibels. Everyone in the diner talked over one another, and it was possible to hear both the din of the restaurant as one throbbing sound and the individual pieces of conversation. The men next to Willie threw their voices at the screen, as though President Johnson stood ready to take their orders from behind the bar. $50, she's on here tomorrow saying the House delayed the vote. It doesn't work like that. How do you know how it works? At least she's not using war as an excuse. The man to Willie's right, whose bald head glistened underneath the harsh fluorescent lights, jabbed his knife at the screen. She's all right. I let her forgive me. What are you even talking about? I'm talking about her priorities and how they're on straight. They keep killing us, and while everyone else wants to pause and look abroad, she's trying to start fixing what's broken. Willie squirmed in her chair, sighing, and they turned to look in her direction. Well, what do you think? I think Johnson's all right. She took a sip of coffee and continued staring at the television, unable to tell them that she'd expected to feel a sense of release or excitement that hadn't yet arrived.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that this is an amazing piece of craft work because of how you use dialogue. There are pieces in here where there's the news in italics, and then there's the speech from the President Johnson in italics. And I'm wondering if you could explain for us, right, how those italicized passages operate as like a soapbox maybe, or like a way to send a message or actually simulate some of the things we might hear in a near-ish future where this may be what we're dealing with as the African American community.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to simulate how it feels when there's something big happening in the news and you're getting pieces of information as you're going about your everyday life. So the purpose of the italics is to kind of bring the reader out of that mindset of reading the character of the dialogues and shift the perspective to understand that, okay, this is a different figure with power talking at the characters in some sense. And so you're sort of trying to get the information at the same time and in the same way that the characters are getting the information. And yeah, I mean, I wrote a lot. I started writing it in 2019, but I wrote a lot of it during the pandemic. And of course, everyone was glued to the news, right? And so I was sort of trying to mimic that experience that I was going through at the time, which is that like you're still working and doing your everyday job, but also you're trying to constantly get information about what's happening. Did I miss anything? Like the news is on in the background all the time. So it kind of mimics that.
That's amazing. And so you have a journalism background.
Sort of.
Sort of. So I wanted to ask you about that as well, because you wrote a piece about reparations during your fellowship at the Atlantic. Yeah. And I wanted you to discuss the transition between journalism and creative writing on this topic in particular. What was your experience kind of changing formats or, you know, tones of expression? And what did you hope that would do for readers who have experienced both your creative work as well as your expose work with the Atlantic?
Yeah. The reason I shy away from calling myself a journalist is because most of my nonfiction tends to have a personal lens in it. So even the Atlantic Fellowship, part of that article includes information about my own family. But the experience of writing it, you know, I was researching a lot about different policies that have been put forth to close the racial wealth gap. And I think now it's to the extent that, the average white family has about 6 times more wealth than the average Black family.
Mhm.
And so I researched for that article, the causes of that gap, but also different policies that people have tried to put forth. And so one of those was reparations. And I think anyone who has studied reparations or is an advocate of reparations, it becomes kind of exhausting trying to justify it because it seems so obvious. um,
Well, the community that's traditionally been against it, they usually see any act of justice as through their lens, through a privilege lens, right? So they see acts of justice and they think that it's an unfair advantage.
right. Yeah, and I was coming off of writing that article where a lot of it is explaining why the gap is as it is today and trying to justify why certain policies should be passed. And I was kind of just tired of trying to justify it. And that's where the fiction came in, which is I was compelled to imagine a world where it already passed. Where like we're not stuck in this never-ending cycle of trying to prove that it's something worthwhile. So that's kind of mostly just fatigue at trying to prove that it was something worth pursuing and wanting to imagine a world where like we're kind of past that. And what would it be like if it did pass, which would have its own set of complications, right? But I think we haven't even been able to get to that point because we haven't even been able to pass HR 40, which is just to study the effects of slavery and discrimination. So, yeah.
Right. And so that's another thing too, is this book came out in February.
Mhm.
And since then we've seen Tennessee, the House actually kill a bill that would have made it illegal to study anything having to do with reparations. And as a writer, it must be very surreal to publish this and then actually see a step that's somewhere in the world of your book take place in real life. And so I wanted to ask you about that experience of having this subject come into national conversation because of Tennessee at the time that your book is published and making the rounds.
Yeah, except that bill is like the opposite of the Forgiveness Act in the book. But yeah, I mean, so when I was writing the book, there were local initiatives being passed, like in Evanston. And so the conversation about reparations was suddenly heightened and charged, and it felt like it was moving forward. And in some way, I was like, am I writing? Because I was writing a world that didn't exist. And then there was sort of like this parallel universe happening where all of these local policies are passing, and I'm writing about a federal policy. But it felt very energizing to me. Like I was like, I'm sort of feeling more hopeful because what I'm writing is sort of, it started from a place of anger, but now we're getting momentum. And then, as often happens, the conversation and energy around remedies for Black people kind of died down. And so then my book came out, and then that bill passed, and it's, yeah, I don't, it's frustrating, and it's the momentum I felt writing it. And with publishing, there's such a long life cycle, right? So it's like I'm writing the book and there's all this momentum. And then by the time I finish it and sell it, everyone has moved on. I mean, not everyone, but the greater conversation has moved on. And so, it's disheartening to say the least, I think. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know yet what else to say about it.
No, I mean, I think it's even having a bill, Tennessee attempting to pass a bill, or politicians in Tennessee attempting to pass a bill that would prevent this simple study and research of it is such a kind of neo-McCarthyism that I think is just within our political moment right now. If we're thinking about Gaza, if we're thinking about suppression of information about Congo and Sudan, we're really kind of facing this wildly moving lens that's attempting to capture all of the inequities of the world while misrepresenting them, right, in certain kind of legacy publications. And this all made me think of, when I was reading your book, I made a note. So the closest thing I can remember about reparations, or
Mhm.
this kind of process you elaborate on in the book, is when, you know, Native Americans to be
Mhm.
recognized by the United States government and receive something that could be called reparations for their people, land grants, et cetera, the
Mhm.
set of standards that they have to fulfill are not based on their own standards for self-definition. They're based on standards set by people who know very little about what it
Right.
means to live and live in the historic trajectory of Native American indigenous peoples. So, like, for example, lots of indigenous groups in California cannot get land grants because they don't fulfill the requirements. And this is the climax of the book, this crisis, right? The way that Black people's history has been burned, maimed, misrepresented, not cataloged, and then the pain of what's there when you do find it. It seemed to have like a parallelism. And I wanted to know how, as a writer, you came to elaborate in the book on the difficulty of just the process of even getting it out there. We started with, you know, the last question, and you were like, I don't know much more to say about it. But you really crystallized what the challenge would be when we got there. So I wanted you to talk a little more about your physical, mental experience of kind of writing through this difficulty, you know, as a Black woman who's written about her own family.
Yeah, I would say it started from a place of catharsis, and it started from a place of wanting to know more about my own family's history. And, you know, it's hard in my family to actually go much farther than the American South. I mean, we can't. And on my mom's side, basically, as in the book, Philadelphia to Virginia is sort of where we stop, and then on my dad's side to Kentucky. But you know, the journey that the character Willie goes on comes from a lot of that desire to want to know more about my own family. Um, and then through writing her experience, it was sort of cathartic, like having this character who is able to find some information. It's not positive information, but she does have a sense of, okay, this is where I come from. Um, and you know, I called it the Forgiveness Act to sort of play on the irony of the
Mm.
people who are being asked to forgive are also assuming the 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 bulk of the burden, and it's on them to prove that they're worthy of forgiveness, which is an absurd thing. But I think we've seen it through different policies that the government enacts all the time, which is that, you know, maybe it's good intentions, but the burden that it puts on the individual or the family to actually um, claim some of this is astounding. And yeah, and you know, I didn't want to write a book that was just like, yes, we need reparations, because I wanted to explore the complications that would exist if it did pass. And part of that is understanding how somebody would prove they're eligible, and what would that mean for the country, and how would that actually logistically come to be. Um, but then again, I was writing it and everyone was applying for PPP money, right? And so it was sort of this weird parallel again, where we see that the country is able to mobilize and disperse funds very quickly if it needs to. So we know it's possible. And so it was sort of like writing the book with that possibility happening, um, and then being able and wanting to explore like the difficulty of Black people Black people being able to research their history. Um,
No, and then also thinking about because through your exegesis of the family, right? The family's experiences. I don't want to give too much away because I want everyone to read it, right? But there's one character that has an intracommunal adoption. And
mm,
intracommunal adoptions, you simply just take on, it's a part of my family. It's a part of so many like Black American families where it's like, you know, you grow up with two sisters, maybe one is your cousin, that does not matter, right? Or, you know, the lady down the street who is your grandmother's best friend, that is your auntie. No, it does not matter. That is family. You're interconnected, right? So
Right.
there's more for us in our communities, this idea of like social and intimate connection rather than this blood nuclear obsession that's based in racism to a certain extent in the United States, where you're supposed to be able to prove you're not Black or your race through your family lineage, right? Like eugenics. And so, you know, you really, really capture. I'm sorry, I have more compliments than questions. You really, you really capture.
I like that.
You really capture this aspect of the perspective of people that are majorly in charge of these systems and how they're disconnected from the experience of Black people. And you also kind of have a great way of writing about the fanfare, the crowd, the protests, and giving character to all of the personalities that would be there. And I wanted to ask you a question about character development. So many characters, each one very specific, each one, you know, having a history that is revealed. Nothing, there's not a spot unpolished in this. And so I wanted to know more about how you develop characters, what your process of that is like, and how you imagine this family. We know, you know, like there's a personal, somewhat of a personal basis for this, but also writers don't always like that, right? Like it's not autobiographical, right?
My
But
family
all about
being
character
like,
development. What went into
yeah, everyone in my family keeps being like, oh, I know who that is. I'm like, no. Yeah, I think that the very, very base foundation is personal, but beyond that, I developed character cards. So I write out a lot, like 1 or 2 pages, like per character, that is everything that I can think of about them, even if it won't go in the book. So like, what do they like to eat? What jokes would they find funny? Like, what are they watching on TV? Just to get a sense of like, okay, who is this person? And then some of it comes out through dialogue that either I keep in the book or that ends up getting cut. But I think for me, like through dialogue is how I learn about a character. And then two, I wanted to showcase the different reactions to the Forgiveness Act and to reparations, and to say through the family and through the different characters, like it's complicated, right? And so not like her dad doesn't really want to pursue it for the time and money. Her grandfather's like, this is stupid. It's not enough money. And so I wanted to use the characters to kind of illuminate the complicated opinions about reparations.
The gender dynamics between the characters are also very, very rich. Sometimes when, you know, I read African American literature, there's this point of exposition, right, where it's just kind of spelled out. There's only one space in the book toward the end where that's really kind of like, dad can be a little misogynistic. But I also wanted to ask you about your representations of Black women as well, because from Willie, her mother, and her daughter, we have such a range of motion, and you're able to show a kind of generational development of liberation for Black women. And I wanted to know about your thought process about that as well. And also how your very gentle way of regarding the way that so oftentimes within the Black community, misogyny shows up as expecting Black women to be self-sacrificial of their own individual narratives and hopes for themselves, either for the family or for the larger community.
Yeah, well, you said it all. I mean, that was, yeah, I think, you know, the forgiveness has many layers in this book. And so one layer is the fact that what the women are asked to forgive. And so they're all being asked to forgive these different things of varying degree so that the family can continue existing as it does. And so for the mom, we see her, you know, giving up a lot of her own ambition and drive. And then for Willie, it's her career and also where she wants to live. So, you know, I wanted to explore the sort of damaging consequences when women are asked to suppress themselves for the family. And And also just, I'm interested in exploring like the subtle misogyny that, like, if somebody were to look at Max, they wouldn't say he's a misogynist or he's sexist, but the things that he asks of his wife and his daughter are
Mm.
not asked of his son. And yeah, I was interested and am interested in exploring those sort of subtle differences and what it does to women and women in a family dynamic, to sort of suppress and forgive so that the family can survive.
And that's a beautiful examination of forgiveness. Like, I think that that's like one of the main questions of the book is, what is that? Is it allowing yourself to be suppressed? Is it, taking something material as an apology without a change of mindset? Is it allowing certain patterns to continue in your life and, forgiving them as they come? And it's just such a it's just such a strong, it hit me personally. Like, what is that even mean when people
Mhm.
ask for that kind of thing? But
Right.
there's also this idea in the novel of the good life, because I think Lourdes says to Willie, it's a good life in terms
Yeah.
of what Willie has for a life, like telling her it's a good life. And I wanted to know more because this comes up between Paloma and her classmates. A good life in terms of what class you live in, a good life in terms of what you have or have not accomplished. It's so rich, and I wanted to know what this meant in this book for these characters. A good life. What does that mean? A good life.
Yeah, I mean, what does it mean for any of us, I guess, was the question I wanted to explore, because in the face of it, it is a good life. She has nothing to complain about. And I think for Black women in particular, there's this expectation of gratitude that I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to explore.
Mm-hmm.
Of She should be thankful that she went to those good schools, that she had the opportunity to work in New York, that she, is living in her parents' beautiful house. And so the interplay of both being grateful but also having all of these regrets. And so can you have a good life if you're circling around these regrets constantly, is what I wanted to explore in the book. And then without giving too much away, you sort of see Paloma break free of that in some sense. And I think I wanted to read it open for the reader to question whether she broke free from her because of her mom or because of the Forgiveness Act, or is it both of those things? Um, and yeah, I mean, I'm always very curious, and a lot of my nonfiction writing has explored that sort of Black middle class, Black upper middle class dynamic of being grateful for reaching a certain point, but then what does that mean for all of the other things you're giving up if you're living in a mostly white neighborhood, if you're not seeing yourself and the people around you, um, and just, yeah, that juxtaposition.
So, will you say more about your experience at your fellowship and about your career trajectory? You say nonfiction. You're like, I don't like to call myself a journalist because there's some personal stuff that's thrown in there
Yeah.
for perspective. But I think that to a certain extent allows you to establish your position in relation to what you're writing, right? And kind of grow a perspective for all of the objectivity that, journalism purports to demand. So, what was your experience like at the Atlantic, and how did you get there?
I mean, it was all done work from home, just to be clear. So I wasn't like walking around the Atlantic newsroom. But yeah, it was a fellowship that I applied for, and in my pitch, I said, coming from my position as a upper middle class Black person, I want to explore my relationship and my family's relationship to money in the context of this greater societal fact of white families having so much more wealth than Black families. So that was sort of the impetus for that article, which was it came from wanting to explore. It came from like starting through the lens of my own family and then broadening um, up to a wider societal view. But yeah, I think most of my non-writing has sort of like most of my nonfiction writing has started from non-writing. Most of my nonfiction
Writers do a lot of that. We do a lot of non-writing.
yeah, exactly. But it's started from wanting to understand like my place in this world that I grew up in and what that means for, you know, my relationship to race and money.
And so it seems like here there's a connectivity for you in your research between perspectives of race and self recognition of race and class, like the
Mhm.
markers you may identify yourself by culturally, materially, or socially are different. Could you say more about just your research in general and what that looks like for you? But about this, because this is a conversation I'm also very interested in, this
Mhm.
thing about race and class and the symbols and expressions that we choose to mark ourselves by publicly and where they come from as opposed to where they end up. Like, that's of
Mhm.
curiosity to me. So I would
Mhm.
love to know more about that experience of yours as studying this interconnectivity between like racial community expression and how class can change that.
Mhm. Yeah, I was doing an event on Monday and somebody pulled out the line. There's a line that talks about the visibility that the family is always walking a line of like being
Mhm.
hyper visible in this neighborhood and then trying to resist that gap between how others perceive them and how they perceive themselves. So I think that line sort of encapsulates a lot of what I try to explore in my writing, which is that um, you know, as a Black person with money, you're sort of forced to walk this line.
Sorry, this is my cat Zora Neale Hurston. She always appears.
um, just being forced to walk that line of being hyper visible because there's fewer Black people with money, and so you're forced to be in these spaces that are predominantly white. And but then you're also sort of taught to feel grateful for being in those spaces. And so, you know, I've always been interested in that sort of Black middle class, Black upper middle class experience for what that says about society. And for, you know, the complicated relationships that that brings with it.
The
Yeah.
word grateful also keeps it's a word that occurs in the book. Grateful, grateful, grateful. But I think we often hear this narrative across racial and class lines in America that comes from the American dream bootstraps myth that's always like, I earned my way here. I earned my way into being, you know, wealthy. And especially on the white demographic side of things, right? Like 90% of people who are considered to be rich or upper middle class inherited their money, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
what's why gratefulness instead of anything else? Um, and then also just the difference in that thing, like you're supposed to be grateful, but we're also supposed to be like, I've earned my way here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel as though gratitude is sort of a personal expectation. It says something about you personally, whether you exhibit the gratitude or not. And then, you know, the sort of like it's I mean, it's a common justification among most white people of why reparations shouldn't pass because there are wealthy Black people, as if that negates any need for reparations. And so, like the criticism that I've heard from people who read my book or read the Atlantic article, which is like, well, Oprah's a billionaire. Like, would she get reparations? Like, it's always taking the the wealth that Black people have made despite the harms that we've had to go through to get it
Mm.
and using it as a justification for why that policy shouldn't exist, which is nonsensical.
It's like out of 30 million of you, 1,000 of you are rich. So
And
there
it's
is
even
no
if
racism.
everyone was rich, it doesn't mean
Right.
that that those harms didn't exist and that it wasn't incredibly more difficult to make that money than it would or should have been.
Right.
But
And also the number, right? The price in the acts of forgiveness, $175,000. How did you get to that number in particular?
yeah, so in researching the book, I spoke a lot with Professor Darity, who has written a book called From Here to Equality,
Mm-hmm.
with his wife, A. Kirsten Mullen, and they break apart some different ways that we could actually get to that number. So their number in the book is a little bit higher, but I backed into 175, sort of like using their different techniques. One of which is, like if Black people are 12% of the U.S. population, for example, what would it take to get it so that Black people own 12% of the wealth in the country?
Mm-hmm.
So those are that's partly where the number comes from. I lowered it a little bit for the plot to make it more realistic. Disclaimer. But yeah, the research behind it, a lot of it comes from that book, From Here to Equality.
Right. The number also seemed to be close to what, 200 years of inflation looks like for, right, the early 18th,
Right.
late 17th century price
Right.
of, people who were forced into chattel slavery experience. So what would be considered like, $100 in 1730 would come to be something
Yeah.
way more based on the inflation as well as that 12% that you're talking about. What
Yeah.
other kinds of books did you read or research did you do? Just in case anybody's looking for more information about this.
I don't know why I have this book so close still, but I do. It's called Finding a Place Called Home. And if anyone is interested in doing genealogy, it's like specifically written for African Americans to figure out what types of documents we should look at in order to retrace our history, because so much has been destroyed. So this book was incredible. Like I used this book so much because it talks about, going to the courthouse, and most courthouses keep significant records, and there can be records of like, somebody like selling a mule that can lead you down a path to find your people. And so that book was really helpful. And then I went to the Mississippi Department of Archives and I met with the employees, and I said, like, here's my character, here's the information she has, like what types of documents would she look at? And they were amazing, and they sat with me and walked me through as if she was a real person, like, okay, here's where she would go, like here's what she would find. But yeah, Finding a Place Called Home was like my Bible.
And how much of because you were talking about the PPP loans, writing this during COVID, right? Which is technically still going on, but
Yeah, right.
also thinking about the stimulus, right? These fast ways that money can be dispensed to the community as well, to different, citizens as well as corporations.
Yeah.
What about the experience of sitting through COVID just made that aspect of it hit you? Because COVID is such a pressurized thing. Even when you're an introvert, being forced to be indoors for a month can kind of get you into like a space, I'll say. So how did the experience of confinement and COVID help you as a writer with these different topics you're dealing with? And then what about it just kind of intensified this witnessing of this massive dispensation of money to corporations, and then as opposed to the little that individuals were passed along?
I would say it energized me, right? Because I started writing it and it was, I explained it to my agent at the time, and she was sort of like, "Oh, this is a nice plot." It seemed like highly, it just seemed so out there. And then suddenly this is all sort of happening right as I'm writing the book. And so it energized me in the sense to be like, okay, well, this is this isn't that far-fetched. Like, it can happen, and we can mobilize to disperse funds pretty quickly. Um, I would say it mostly fueled me to write quicker. It's like, I got to get this thing out while this is still happening, which of course is not
You
possible with
gotta
the
strike while
timeline.
the iron is hot.
Yeah, right. I'm like, but yeah, it's like, and then there's protests in the book, which obviously there were protests happening. So that was difficult to write because there are real people dying. And I'm writing fiction. And so those parts were tough to write as the protests for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were happening. And I'm like writing these scenes that I started writing before COVID, because I mean, and part of the reason why there's no year explicitly stated in the book is because I wanted it to be understood that it could be 10 years ago or it could be now, because all of this has always been happening. So yeah, it was both energizing, I guess, and also hard.
And this, what you're speaking about in terms of the protests,
Mhm.
there's this rift, right, between culture and policy. And I mentioned this earlier, and it's like a lot of privileged communities will view justice as welfare.
Mhm.
Like this is a form of welfare. And this
Mhm.
is the feeling that we get from multiple characters across racial lines in the book Acts of Forgiveness. There's a point at which one of the patriarchal figures is like, treats it like, I don't need this. I made it. I don't want this, as like a source of shame.
Yeah.
And so what do you think as a writer, how did you come to think about this mindset? It's a very American mindset where providing justice for one group is viewed as welfare, even within the group that needs the justice.
I think about it more along generational lines, I guess, and sort of some of the conversations happening in my own family in terms of, the older generation in some sense is sort of like, it's never going to happen. So why are we wasting our energy looking at it? And that's not to say that they maybe don't want it to happen. It's just energy is scarce. And so where are you going to put it? So yeah, I mean, I started thinking about it, I guess, along generational lines.
Yeah. And it's also thinking about like that aspect of like racial privilege, right? There's Charles Mills wrote a book called The Racial Contract. And he says so much of the privilege we don't talk about, the racial privilege, is that some communities are able to ignore history, not know it, and therefore not accept or integrate their own identity into this like trajectory. It's something that they can just like ignore. And so without the information or the conviction, justice would seem like welfare to them, especially if they come from poorer, isolated, rural areas.
Yeah.
And that made me also think about the way that the South was depicted, right? I think in my experience as a Southerner, having lived in the North, lived in Chicago, lived in New York, like it's always, oh, is it scary down there? Is it dangerous down there? And I'm always like, I'm like the conundrum of the South is that the same person at Walmart that will call you an N-word will say good morning to you because they live across the street. This is the conundrum, because it's maintaining the sense of superiority just by having the ability to take you down with a word just because you're Black. But you said that you traveled to Mississippi, and I wanted to know how you built that world, right? Because you are from Philadelphia, your family's from Philadelphia, Virginia, the DMV area, Philly area. And there's such this beautiful depiction of the South. It's very Gothic, right? But then I'm also thinking about like the sense of objectivity you bring to the description as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote parts of it before I went, and then I traveled to Jackson and Natchez, and I had a great time there. the people were so, like, the employees at the archives and at the Historic Natchez Foundation, there's lines in that part of the book that come from what the employees said to me. Like, I think there's one line in there, I forget who says it at this point, but I finished writing this a long time ago. But
like saying, talking to a writer and you don't know it. You're like, you never know when you'll end up in my book.
They said, they say something to the effect that, like, we have our ghosts, but we're not afraid to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I felt, which is that it's all sort of out there. Like, race on the East Coast is very like, no, everyone's respectable, no one's racist here, and it's all very like under the surface to some extent. Mm-hmm. Of like the country clubs that, like, you're not banned from, but, like, do you really want to be there? Do you really feel welcome?
But a stranger will come up to you and remind you, yeah, I don't think they're gonna have like fried chicken on the menu, and you're like,
right. So there's that, versus in the South, the history is so visceral. Mm-hmm. That there's no hiding from it. Everything is out there. And so I guess, writing about it came from my experience, actually being there to research for the book. And the interactions and the relationships I had when I was there formed the basis of that part of the book, which is that there's discomfort, but also openness. And people are making eye contact, and people are saying good morning, and you're wondering, is it gonna get dicey? But there's such a, like, willingness, and there's a willingness to talk about it that is very different, I think, sometimes on the East Coast, which is that everyone sort of pretends that there is no race, there's no racism.
Right. And so I wanted to know as well, and we kind of got into this because we were having a conversation before we even started. We signed on early. Was the novel also your way of showing readers the possibility of this in action, like a way to introduce into our imaginations this greater possibility and how it could play out, a way to make it real for people that read it?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the conversation about reparations, we were talking about this a little bit, but it's always statistics and politics. And I wanted to use this book to say, no, it's about the people. And to pull it out of those conversations that it always gets stuck in, which is that, like, the amounts of wealth and how would it actually work, and it's too complicated to enact, and to just make it about a family and look at what it means for a family and for the people, because really that's the heart of anyone who's advocating for reparations. It's about what it means for individual people and individual families. Mm-hmm. So,
and then it's also a part of this, the other thing that Acts of Forgiveness achieves, that you achieve in Acts of Forgiveness, is, there are so many interactions between the protagonists and other people in their immediate community that just kind of show, like, make very visceral this thin veil of acknowledgement and realization, right? And the danger, the intensity of the book comes from half of the community in the book really not having to deal with any of the apprehensions or anxieties that the protagonist Black family is, like, dealing with. Mm-hmm. It kind of reminded me of Claudia Rankine's poetry in this way, where it's just these simple slights, these everyday acts that are demeaning, right? Mm-hmm. That people seem to slip and slide out of in this way that you can't, microaggressions. You cannot tell if it's malicious or if it's just a part of people just not having any kind of conscientiousness. What was it like for you to try to work through writing these instances that keep occurring in the book? It just happens, and you're able to catch the reality of it being so much of like a drive-by. Like, did that happen? Like Paloma, and her interaction with her classmate that was in her room, like her classmate having no sense of what this means, what it can mean for Paloma, but Paloma knowing exactly what it means.
Right. A lot of those are taken from my own experience, to be blunt, of like microaggressions and then the feeling that they're crazy making. Because then you're left wondering, did that actually happen? What was the intent behind that? Am I overreacting? And so the burden is again on the person who's experiencing it because the other person's already forgotten or moved on. And so then you're sort of weighing, do I bring it up? Was it anything? You're sort of like having these conversations in your mind. So I tried to mimic some of what I've experienced in predominantly white spaces, which is like those sort of comments that maybe aren't large to the person, and the lingering effects of those.
Mm, mm. And so writing, as we were talking about, is not easy, especially with the way that the market is changing, right? Maybe it was 30 years ago, someone would cold mail a manuscript, get an agent, and then all of the promotion and knowledge building to the world about who this person is happens. But now, to get an agent, you can't just be a great writer, you need a following, or you need to know a certain crowd and have professionalized and know a certain amount of people. And if you don't play the social media game, this can be hard and make things harder. And the market for Black artists also fluctuates with the tastes of the dominant audience, right? When money can be made from our stories and they're current with the moment, then it happens. But then we go back to this dip where it's hard to find ourselves in shows and movies all of a sudden, or it's hard to find the books all of a sudden. What has it been like for you as a writer growing in this quickly changing environment that seems to just be making very rapid shifts and changes almost at random? Like, it's very hard to predict what the literary market is going to do, or how you'll get an agent, or if that will even be productive if you don't already have a built-in audience.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I don't really like social media. I like finally logged on today and saw you tagged me and I was like, oh shoot. But I for me, I just try to remember the writing and why I'm doing it. And I think even if, like, I was reading an article before I logged on about how there won't be any human writers because everyone's using AI and it'll just be like people are plugging in how to structure a novel like this. But for me, like, the joy of writing is figuring out how to make it work and like sitting down at the computer, deleting words, figuring out like what sentence works. So I think, especially after this book came out, I sold it during a moment where there was high intensity and everyone's talking about Black bodies. And then that changed, and now my book is out and it's doing fine, but probably not as well as if it had come out in 2020. And so I think there's a little bit of an existential, like, well, what am I doing this for? And I will continue to do it regardless because it's what I love. And I think most writers are like that, which is that, like, if you love writing, you're going to do it, and maybe you get an agent and maybe you don't, and like the chance of that sucks, but at the end of the day, it's one of the only art forms where you really don't need anything except like
Yeah.
a pen and paper. Like, you can be a writer. What that means, I think in today's time, like, the advice that I usually give to young writers is to like be specific about what you want from your career. And like, do you want a small publisher because you just want your book out there? Or do you really want to be like a mass market author? And so does that mean you have to look at the environment and change the way you're approaching your art form? So I don't know. I think the advice I try to give is always like start being specific about what you want from your writing career. Because I think in the industry, there's always a hesitation to treat it like a business. And then there's like a rude awakening when your book comes out and you realize it is a business.
Right.
And so especially for Black writers, I think arming yourself with the knowledge of like, what does it mean for my career? What career do you actually want? And then figuring out how to go from there.
Did you find that you had a struggle during the editing process with this idea of palatability? So often when I talk to Black writers that are really approaching these topics, like going in, right?
Yeah.
There's always this moment where they say, there were things that I had to change that the editor said had to be more palatable. During the writing process, were you concerned that the subject matter may, and your honesty, your honest representation of it would somehow affect its readership, affect people feeling when they shouldn't? I want to just emphasize feeling when they shouldn't, that it's some kind of personal attack, right, against them. Did you have these anxieties? Because it's such for as much as reparations slips in and out of our national consciousness as a conversation, to bring it up anywhere at any time always gets extreme reaction.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I was really nervous. I was nervous about the reaction. You know, I was also nervous during the editing process of like, you know, as a writer, you're always, it's hard when your work starts being like fondled by other people. And so
you're like, what are you doing in there, rummaging around?
Yeah. So there were definitely parts that got cut that, you know, I miss. But, and so that was hard, of just walking this line of like, again, it's a business, right? And so the publisher, when they bought it, they have an idea in their mind what it's going to be marketed as and where that's going to fit in their catalog. And then you as a writer are sort of like playing catch up with that. And so, yeah, there were anxieties around what it was being changed into, or what I wouldn't let go of. And then, yeah, the added anxiety of just like knowing that I'm writing about a book about reparations, and like, you know, it's also hard as a Black author, because there's, you know, like it's almost cliche. It's like a Black writer writing about reparations. And so I had fear about like falling into that and not wanting to be seen as like, you know, like cliche, or like trying to go after some moment, instead of what I felt, which was that like wanting to explore an art form and explore art.
What is a scene that's not here that you wish was?
Well, there used to be,
allowed to share that?
I mean, I guess there used to be whole chapters from Lourdes' perspective that have been
they've been know about Lourdes.
They've been woven in, but yeah, there's a couple of scenes that are like from her perspective that are near and dear to me.
And my last question is, what should we be looking forward to from you in the near future? What ideas are percolating? What are you working on next? Where can we expect to see you so we can keep up with you on Instagram at Maura Cheeks?
On Instagram. I'm kidding. Well, I'm opening a bookstore and wine bar in Brooklyn. And so please come visit whenever you're around. I'd love to have you.
Share the name. What's the name of it?
Liz's Book Bar. It's named after my grandmother.
That's amazing. What neighborhood in Brooklyn is it in?
It's in Carroll Gardens.
Okay.
Yeah, so please come visit. And yeah, I've been working on a second book, still fleshing out what it's about. But at the core, I think it's about like human connection and how we can save other people if we're always the one being saved. That's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Maura. Come back, be with Lit Friday, May 31st. We have Yale Younger Prize-winning poet Araya D. Matthews with us at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to discuss her recent release of a poetry collection called Bread and Circus. If you were in Pittsburgh tonight, turn this computer off and go to the August Wilson African American Cultural Center so you can see Maya perform.
I wish I could go to that. That's
I know, I'm so mad I'm not there right now. But if you can, turn the computer off and go. And we would love to have you back when the next project comes out. Let us know when the bookstore happens so we can drive traffic to it. And congratulations on all your success, the great reviews, the business, and the book. We're very grateful to have you.
Thank you for having me. This was lovely.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.